December 1944, the Ardennes forest. Snow fell in thick curtains across the Belgian countryside, muffling the distant rumble of artillery fire. In a hastily dug foxhole network somewhere between Bastogne and the German lines, Sergeant William Hayes crouched over a battered map, his breath forming white clouds in the freezing air. The 28-year-old NCO from Pittsburgh had seen more combat in the past 6 months than he ever imagined possible, but nothing had prepared him for this. His unit, a mixed company of infantry and weapons specialists, had been cut off for 3 days now. Ammunition was running dangerously low, and German forces were tightening the noose with every passing hour. If you're enjoying this story of innovation and survival against impossible odds, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. It helps us bring you more incredible true stories from history. Hayes wiped frost from his stubbled chin and looked across at his mortar crew. Private Danny Morrison, barely 20 years old, sat shivering despite 3 layers of clothing. Corporal James Tucker methodically cleaned the 60mm mortar tube for the 5th time that morning, more out of nervous habit than necessity. The defensive weapon had served them well, lobbing high-arcing shells at German positions, buying precious time. But defensive wasn't going to get them out of this trap. They needed offense. They needed breakthrough power. The morning briefing had been grim. Lieutenant Richardson, looking 10 years older than his 32 years, had laid out their situation with brutal honesty. German armor was massing 2 kilometers east. Panzer divisions, the kind that could roll over their position like a freight train over a tin can. Their anti-tank capabilities consisted of 2 bazookas with 4 rockets between them, and whatever improvisation they could muster. The nearest Allied forces were at least 15 kilometers away, fighting their own desperate battles. No one was coming to save them. Hayes studied the mortar tubes again. Standard issue M2 60mm mortars, designed to fire at angles between 45 and 85 degrees. High trajectory weapons meant to drop shells behind cover, into trenches, onto enemy positions from above. But what if you could change the geometry? What if you could turn that vertical fire into something more direct, more aggressive? The idea had been percolating in his mind since yesterday evening, born from desperation and a background in mechanical engineering that seemed like a lifetime ago. He'd spent 3 years working in a steel mill before the war, understanding angles, forces, stress points. The principle was simple enough in theory. Cross 2 mortar tubes at a lower angle, create a V-shaped configuration, and you could potentially fire shells in a more horizontal trajectory, direct fire instead of indirect. Turn a defensive tool into an attack weapon. The problem was implementation. These tubes weren't designed for that kind of stress. They could rupture, explode, kill everyone in a 10-meter radius. But doing nothing guaranteed death just as surely. Tucker noticed Hayes staring at the equipment. The corporal was from Tennessee, a farmer's son who'd proven himself steady under fire. Hayes trusted him completely, which made what he was about to propose even harder. "Hey, Sarge, what's running through your head?" Tucker asked, his southern drawl somehow comforting even in this frozen hell. Hayes hesitated, then gestured for Morrison and Tucker to come closer. "What I'm about to suggest is crazy," he began. "Maybe too crazy. But I need you to hear me out." He explained his concept, using stick diagrams drawn in the snow. The crossed tubes would be mounted on a reinforced base, angled at roughly 30 degrees instead of the standard high trajectory. They'd need to calculate new firing solutions, account for different stresses on the metal, and probably pray that the whole thing didn't blow up in their faces. Morrison's eyes widened with each detail. "That's insane, Sarge. Those tubes weren't built for that kind of lateral stress." Hayes nodded. "I know. That's why we're going to reinforce them. Strip metal from the supply truck, create external bands. We'll also need to modify the firing sequence, stagger the shots to distribute recoil." Tucker rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. Even if we get it working, how many shots before the tubes give out? Hayes met his gaze steadily. Maybe 5, maybe 10, maybe 1 before everything goes to hell. But right now, we've got mortars that can harass the enemy and not much else. This gives us a chance to punch through their armor support, take out a panzer or two before they overrun us. That might be enough to create an opening for the company to break out. The weight of the decision hung in the frozen air between them. Morrison looked terrified but determined. Tucker's expression remained thoughtful. Finally, the corporal spoke. "My daddy always said that desperate times call for desperate measures. I reckon these times qualify." "If you think this can work, Sarge, I'm with you." Morrison swallowed hard, then nodded. "Me too. I didn't survive Normandy Beach to die in a Belgian forest without trying everything." Over the next 8 hours, they worked with focused intensity. Hayes requisitioned metal strips from a damaged supply truck, ignoring the quartermaster's protests about regulation violations. The quartermaster, a nervous staff sergeant from Ohio named Paulson, had been keeping inventory records meticulously throughout the campaign, as if proper paperwork would somehow protect them from German shells. "Sarge, I can't just sign off on this without proper authorization," Paulson protested, his voice rising. "These are critical supply materials." Hayes turned to face him, his expression harder than the frozen ground beneath their feet. "Sergeant Paulson, in about 12 hours, German tanks are going to roll through this position. When that happens, your inventory sheets won't mean a damn thing. Now you can either sign off on this requisition, or I can take what I need anyway, and you can file a complaint with whoever's left alive tomorrow. Your choice." Paulson stared at him for a long moment, then grabbed his clipboard and scrawled a signature. "Fine, but this is on your head, Hayes, not mine." Hayes nodded. "Everything's on my head, Paulson. That's what sergeants are for." They used welding equipment salvaged from an abandoned farmhouse about 200 meters from their position. The farmhouse had taken a direct hit during an earlier bombardment, its roof collapsed and walls partially destroyed. But the basement still held tools, equipment the Belgian owners had left behind when they fled. Hayes felt a pang of guilt using their possessions without permission, but survival trumped property rights. Tucker proved surprisingly skilled with the welding torch, his farm background translating well to metalwork. "I used to repair tractors and equipment back home," he explained, his hands steady despite the cold. "My daddy always said a farmer who can't fix his own machinery will go broke waiting for repairmen." The philosophy served them well now, practical skills mattering more than any military training manual. Morrison assisted, holding pieces in place while Tucker welded, learning through observation and occasional instruction. The young private had quick hands and quicker understanding, grasping concepts almost before they were fully explained. The design evolved through trial and error. The first mounting system collapsed under the weight of the tubes, metal bending under stress that exceeded their calculations. Hayes studied the failure, making mental notes. The stress distribution wasn't even. "We need a wider base, more support points." They tried again. The second configuration created an angle that would send shells directly into the ground 20 meters ahead, useless for their purposes. The geometry was wrong, the pivot points misaligned. Morrison ran new calculations, double-checking his mathematics by firelight. The angle needs to be exactly 32 degrees, not 30. Every degree matters when you're trying to hit a moving target at 600 meters. The third attempt looked promising. The crossed tubes sat at the correct angle, the mounting seemed stable, and the reinforcement bands were positioned at calculated stress points. But when they tested the mechanism with an empty firing sequence, the recoil simulation showed the entire assembly would shift backward with each shot, destroying any hope of accuracy. "We need anchors," Hayes decided. "Something to keep the whole thing from jumping backward when we fire." They spent another hour driving metal stakes deep into the frozen ground, creating a backstop that would absorb rearward momentum. Morrison found additional stabilizing brackets in the ruined farmhouse, pieces that had once held farming equipment but now served military purposes. By mid-afternoon, they had something that resembled Hayes's original vision. Two mortar tubes crossed in a V formation, mounted on a reinforced steel base made from truck panels. External bands of metal wrapped around the tubes at critical stress points, welded carefully to distribute force. The whole contraption looked like something from a mad scientist's workshop, all improvised angles and desperate engineering. But the mathematics checked out, in theory. Lieutenant Richardson came to inspect their work just as the winter sun began its early descent toward the horizon. The young officer stared at the crossed mortars for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Hayes stood at attention, ready to defend his unauthorized weapon modification. Richardson circled the installation twice, examining every weld, every angle, every reinforcement. Finally he spoke. "This is either brilliant or suicidal, Sergeant. Possibly both." Hayes allowed himself a small smile. "That's pretty much the assessment we came to, sir." Richardson crouched down, sighting along the modified tubes. "What's your estimated effective range?" Hayes pulled out his calculations, pages of hastily scribbled mathematics. "Based on the angle and assuming the tubes hold, we're looking at roughly 800 meters effective range. Direct fire. The shells will travel on a much flatter trajectory than standard mortar rounds. If we load with high explosive rounds, we've got a chance against light armor, maybe even disable a panzer if we get lucky with a track hit." The lieutenant studied the numbers, his engineering education from West Point evident in how quickly he processed the data. "The stress calculations concern me. You're pushing these tubes way beyond their design specifications." Hayes nodded. "Yes, sir. That's why we reinforce them. But I won't lie to you. After a few shots, we're in unknown territory. The metal could fail catastrophically." Richardson stood, brushing snow from his knees. His next words were measured, carrying the weight of command. "Tomorrow morning, German armor will likely launch a coordinated assault on our position. We have limited anti-tank capabilities. If your weapon can knock out even one or two vehicles, it might buy us the time we need for a breakout. You're authorized to proceed." Relief and anxiety warred in Hayes's chest. "Thank you, sir." Richardson's expression softened slightly. "But, Sergeant, make damn sure your crew understands the risks. This is volunteer work only. No one should feel pressured to man a weapon that might explode." Hayes saluted. "Understood, sir." After the lieutenant departed, Hayes gathered his crew for a final briefing. He was completely honest about the dangers, about the untested nature of their creation, about the possibility of catastrophic failure. When he finished, he asked who would volunteer to operate the weapon during tomorrow's battle. Morrison raised his hand immediately. "I'm in, Sarge, all the way." Tucker followed suit. "Someone's got to make sure you two don't get yourselves killed. Besides, my wife would never forgive me if I let you have all the glory." Despite the tension, Hayes found himself smiling. "All right then. We're a crew. Let's spend the evening running drills, getting the loading sequence perfect. If we're going to do this, we're going to do it right." They worked through the evening by moonlight and the dim glow of hooded lanterns. Loading drill. Elevation check. Firing sequence. Communication protocols. Each movement was practiced until it became muscle memory. Morrison proved surprisingly adept at calculating firing solutions on the fly, his mathematical aptitude finally finding purpose beyond classroom theory. Tucker's steady hands managed the loading process with the careful precision of someone handling unstable explosives, which wasn't far from the truth. Around midnight, Corporal Sarah Jensen from the Medical Corps brought them hot coffee and what passed for dinner, canned rations heated over a small fire. The 26-year-old nurse from Chicago had been with the unit since the landing at Normandy, earning everyone's respect through countless acts of courage under fire. She studied their improvised weapon with professional concern. I'm all for innovation, but please tell me you've thought about the medical implications if this thing fails. Hayes accepted the coffee gratefully, feeling its warmth spread through his frozen fingers. We've got a blast radius calculated, sandbag barriers here and here, and your aid station is positioned well back from the firing line. Jensen's expression remained skeptical. The engineering might be sound, Sergeant, but you're still gambling with physics you can't fully predict. Just promise me you'll be careful. These men trust you. Hayes looked at Morrison and Tucker, seeing the same trust Jensen mentioned reflected in their faces. That trust was both humbling and terrifying. I promise we'll be as careful as circumstances allow. Jensen nodded, seemed about to say more, then simply touched Hayes's shoulder briefly before returning to her duties. The gesture conveyed more than words could have. The night passed slowly, filled with the sounds of distant artillery and the movements of soldiers preparing for battle. Hayes tried to sleep, but found his mind racing through calculations, scenarios, potential failure points. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the crossed mortars exploding, saw Tucker and Morrison caught in the blast, saw the entire plan collapsing into catastrophic failure. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him like a physical force. These men trusted him. Their lives depended on his calculations being correct, on metal behaving as predicted, on 1,000 variables aligning perfectly. Around 3 in the morning, he finally gave up on sleep entirely and walked the perimeter, checking defensive positions and speaking quietly with the men on watch. Private Jenkins, a 19-year-old from Nebraska, was manning a machine gun position overlooking the eastern approaches. The kid looked cold and scared, emotions Hayes understood completely. "How you holding up, Jenkins?" The private managed a weak smile. "Honestly, Sarge, I'm terrified. My hands won't stop shaking, and it's not just from the cold." Hayes sat down beside him, sharing the narrow foxhole. "Fear's natural. Anyone who says they're not scared before a battle is either lying or crazy. The trick is not letting the fear paralyze you." Jenkins nodded slowly. "Did you feel like this before Normandy?" Hayes remembered that morning, the landing craft approaching the beach, the sound of German machine guns, the water turning red. "Yeah, worse, actually. At least here we've got prepared positions. On that beach, we had nothing but each other." Jenkins seemed to take comfort from that. "We made it through that. Guess we can make it through this too." Hayes continued his round, stopping at each position, offering what reassurance he could. Corporal Williams from the mortar platoon was checking ammunition counts for the 3rd time, his movements mechanical, repetitive. Williams had lost his best friend 2 weeks earlier to German artillery, and the loss had left visible marks. He worked constantly now, as if staying busy could keep grief at bay. Hayes understood that too. Sometimes the only way to keep functioning was to focus on the immediate task, to narrow the world down to the next action, the next responsibility. "You need anything, Williams?" The corporal shook his head. "Just trying to make sure we're ready, Sarge." Hayes gripped his shoulder briefly. "We're as ready as we can be. Now try to rest. Tomorrow's going to be a long day." At one position, Hayes found Sergeant Mike Reeves, a squad leader from Brooklyn who'd been in the Army since before Pearl Harbor. Reeves was the kind of NCO every unit valued, experienced, steady, someone who could be counted on when everything went to hell. The two sergeants stood together in companionable silence for a moment, watching the darkness beyond their perimeter. Reeves spoke first, his Brooklyn accent thick, even after years away from home. "Heard about your mortar project." "That's some crazy thinking, Hayes." Hayes smiled slightly. "Coming from you, I'm not sure if that's a compliment or an insult." Reeves chuckled quietly, little bit of both. "But crazy's what this situation calls for. Just make sure you don't get yourself killed trying to be a hero. Heroes are great in newspapers. Dead heroes are just dead." Hayes appreciated the straightforward honesty. "No intention of dying tomorrow, Mike. Got too much to live for." Reeves lit a cigarette, cupping the flame carefully to avoid giving away their position. We all do. That's what makes this so hard. Every man here has people waiting for them back home, families, futures, and we're asking them to risk all of that tomorrow. Hayes thought about his own family, his mother and father in Pittsburgh, his younger sister who'd written him long letters throughout the war. They felt impossibly distant, like characters in someone else's story. The only reality was this frozen forest, these desperate men, and the approaching dawn. We're not asking them to throw their lives away, Mike. We're asking them to fight for survival. There's a difference. Reeves took a long drag on his cigarette, the ember glowing briefly. Is there? Sometimes I wonder. We follow orders, we do our duty, and we hope that's enough, but at the end of the day we're just trying not to die. Hayes couldn't argue with that assessment. It was too honest, too true. Yeah, that's about the size of it. The two sergeants stood together a while longer, sharing the weight of command, the burden of sending men into danger. Then Reeves ground out his cigarette and returned to his squad. See you on the other side, Hayes. Whatever happens tomorrow. Hayes watched him go, feeling the profound loneliness of leadership. You made decisions that affected lives, and you carried the consequences whether things went right or wrong. Around 4 in the morning, Hayes returned to the mortar position where Tucker and Morrison were attempting to catch a few hours of rest. Both men were awake, sleep as elusive for them as it had been for Hayes. They sat together in the foxhole, 3 men facing impossible odds, drawing strength from shared determination. Tucker broke the silence first. My wife's pregnant. Due in March. I haven't told anyone else. Afraid if I say it out loud, I'll jinx it somehow. Hayes felt the weight of that confession. Tucker had even more reason than most to survive. That's wonderful news, James. Congratulations. Tucker smiled, but his eyes remained serious. Makes tomorrow feel different, you know. Used to be just my life on the line. Now I've got a son or daughter I've never met, depending on me to make it home. Morrison spoke quietly. I've got a girl back home. Mary. We were talking about getting married after the war. Haven't proposed yet, though. Keep thinking I should wait until I'm sure I'm going to survive this thing. Hayes understood that fear too, the reluctance to make promises you might not live to keep. If you love her, Danny, tell her. Don't wait for perfect circumstances. This war's taught me that much at least. Morrison nodded slowly. Maybe I'll write her a letter. Tonight. Before tomorrow. The young private paused, then added, Thanks, Sarge, for everything. Even if this all goes sideways tomorrow, thanks for giving us a chance. The gratitude in Morrison's voice made Hayes's chest tighten. He'd done what he thought necessary, but hearing appreciation from men who trusted him enough to follow his crazy plan struck something deep. The 3 of them talked through the remaining hours of darkness, sharing stories from before the war, memories of homes and families and lives that seemed impossibly distant. Tucker spoke about his Tennessee farm, about planting seasons and harvest, about a life built around the rhythms of nature rather than the chaos of combat. Morrison talked about his college plans, about wanting to teach mathematics, about seeing beauty in numbers and equations. Hayes shared memories of Pittsburgh, of working in the steel mill, of understanding how metal behaved under stress and heat. Those conversations, more than any military planning, gave them strength for what was coming. They weren't just soldiers following orders. They were men with futures, with people who loved them, with reasons to survive beyond simple duty. Dawn came reluctantly, grey light filtering through heavy clouds that promised more snow. Hayes and his crew were already at their positions. The crossed mortars aimed toward the eastern approaches, where intelligence suggested the German armor would advance. The weapon looked even more improvised in daylight, a testament to desperate ingenuity. But Hayes had triple-checked every weld, every calculation, every reinforcement. If it was going to work, this was as good as they could make it. The metal was cold under his hands, frost forming intricate patterns on the steel surfaces. He thought about the physics at play, about the forces they were asking this improvised weapon to contain. The tubes would experience lateral stress far beyond their design specifications. The mounting would absorb recoil from angles it was never meant to handle. The reinforcement bands would either distribute the force or fail catastrophically. Mathematics could predict probabilities, but reality would have the final word. At 0600 hours, Lieutenant Richardson made his way along the defensive line, checking each position, offering words of encouragement where needed. When he reached the mortar position, he crouched beside Hayes, both men keeping low to avoid presenting targets. "Morning, Sergeant. How are you feeling?" Hayes considered the question honestly. "Scared, sir. Determined. Ready as I'll ever be." Richardson nodded. "That's about where I am too." He looked at the crossed mortars, then back at Hayes. "Whatever happens today, I want you to know that your initiative, your willingness to think outside standard doctrine, that's made a difference. Win or lose, you've given us a fighting chance." Hayes appreciated the acknowledgement, though he hoped desperately that it wouldn't become a eulogy. At 06:15, the German artillery barrage began, right on schedule. Shells screamed overhead, impacting throughout the American positions with devastating precision. The ground shook with each explosion, dirt and snow fountaining into the air. Men pressed themselves into foxholes, making themselves as small as possible, praying the next shell wouldn't have their name on it. Hayes kept his head up, watching the eastern tree line through binoculars despite the danger. He needed to see the German advance the moment it began, needed every second of warning he could get. Tucker and Morrison crouched ready beside the crossed mortars, high explosive rounds prepared for immediate loading. Morrison's hands shook slightly. Whether from fear or cold was impossible to say. Probably both. Tucker's expression was set, determined, the face of a man who'd made peace with whatever came next. The barrage lasted 20 minutes, though it felt like hours. Each explosion was a physical assault, concussive force that rattled teeth and organs. Hayes tasted blood from a bitten tongue, felt his ears ringing despite trying to keep his mouth open to equalize pressure. Around them, men screamed as shells found targets. Medics rushed through the chaos, rendering aid where possible, offering comfort where aid wasn't enough. Hayes forced himself to maintain focus. The barrage was just preparation. The real test was coming. Then, as suddenly as it started, the artillery fire stopped. The silence that followed was somehow more unsettling than the explosions had been. Now, Hayes thought, now it begins. He raised his binoculars again, scanning the tree line intently. Hayes knew what came next. Armor. Right on schedule, he heard the distinctive rumble of panzer engines, that deep mechanical growl that struck fear into infantry hearts across every front. 3 tanks emerged from the tree line, accompanied by roughly 50 infantry soldiers, Mark IV panzers, medium tanks bristling with weapons and thick armor. Behind them, Hayes spotted 2 more vehicles, probably personnel carriers. Lieutenant Richardson's voice crackled over the field radio. "All positions, hold fire until my command. Let them get closer." Hayes felt his heart hammering against his ribs. Everything came down to the next few minutes. He'd positioned the crossed mortars carefully, calculating angles and ranges based on likely approach routes. Now he'd find out if his mathematics matched reality. The German advance continued, methodical and confident. At 600 meters, Hayes could make out individual details on the lead panzer, the commander visible in the turret, scanning for threats. At 400 meters, Richardson's voice came sharp and clear. "All weapons, fire at will. Repeat, fire at will." Hayes spoke calmly to his crew, years of training keeping his voice steady despite the adrenaline. Morrison firing solution for lead tank. Elevation 28 degrees, deflection 06 mils, load high explosive. Morrison acknowledged, his young face set with determination. Tucker moved with practiced efficiency, loading the first round into the right mortar tube. The cross design required sequential firing to manage recoil, exactly as Hayes had calculated. "Ready to fire right tube," Tucker reported. Hayes took a breath, said a silent prayer to whatever forces watched over desperate soldiers, and gave the command. "Fire." Tucker triggered the firing mechanism. The mortar round launched with a sharp crack that sounded different from standard mortar fire, flatter, more aggressive. The crossed tubes absorbed the recoil, the reinforced mounting holding steady. Hayes tracked the shell's flight, seeing it arc on that lower, more direct trajectory he'd designed for. 3 seconds felt like 3 hours. Then the round impacted directly in front of the lead panzer, exploding in a fountain of earth and shrapnel. Close, but not close enough. Morrison was already calling corrections. Deflection plus 0.2 mils, same elevation. Left tube loading, Tucker reported. Fire. The second round launched, following that same aggressive trajectory. This time, Hayes saw it strike the panzer's front glacis plate, exploding on impact. The armor held, the tank was too well protected for a direct frontal assault. But the explosion obscured the driver's vision, and the panzer slewed slightly off course, giving the American anti-tank teams precious seconds to reposition. The crossed mortars had worked. They hadn't destroyed the tank yet, but they'd proven the concept. Direct fire from a defensive weapon. Hayes felt a surge of fierce satisfaction, quickly tamped down by the reality of battle still unfolding. "Right tube loading," Tucker called out. Hayes was already calculating the next shot. "We go for tracks. Morrison, target the lead tank's left track assembly. Deflection minus 0.4 mils, elevation 26 degrees. Morrison confirmed the solution. Tucker loaded. Fire. The third round caught the panzer perfectly, impacting just below the main body where the track met the drive wheel. The explosion severed the track, sending metal links flying. The tank lurched to a halt, suddenly immobilized. The commander was still trying to bring his main gun to bear when a bazooka team took advantage of the stop target, firing a rocket into the thinner side armor. The panzer erupted in flames, its ammunition cooking off in a series of secondary explosions. One down. The other 2 panzers had identified Hayes' position as a threat now. Their turrets swung toward the crossed mortars, main guns seeking targets. Hayes knew they had perhaps seconds before those guns fired. The German infantry was advancing rapidly, trying to overwhelm the American positions through sheer momentum. "Fire discipline," Hayes ordered, keeping his voice level. "Tucker, Morrison, we take the second tank. Same targeting priority. Track systems. Make them stop moving." They worked in perfect synchronization, each man knowing his role exactly. Load. Aim. Fire. The fourth round missed, impacting to the right of the second panzer. Morrison called a quick correction. Tucker loaded the left tube. Fire. The fifth round hit the track assembly squarely, but the angle was wrong. The track held. The panzer kept advancing, now just 200 meters away. Its main gun fired, the shells screaming past Hayes' position and exploding 30 meters behind them. The shockwave knocked Morrison flat. The young private scrambled back to his feet, ears ringing but focused. I'm good! Firing solution adjustment. Right tube loaded," Tucker reported, his drawl somehow still calm despite the chaos. Hayes could see the panzer's main gun reloading, the loader visible through the open hatch working frantically. They had maybe 10 seconds. Morrison, best guess now. "We don't have time for perfection." Morrison rattled off numbers, trusting instinct and training. Hayes didn't hesitate. Fire. The sixth round launched, and Hayes watched its flight with the strange clarity combat sometimes brings, where time seems to slow and every detail becomes crystalline. The shell hit the panzer's track just as the tank crested a small rise in the terrain. The explosion sheared through the track mechanism, and the tank's own momentum worked against it. The broken track wrapped around the drive wheel, jamming the entire system. The panzer ground to a halt. Before its crew could assess the damage, Lieutenant Richardson's voice came over the radio. All anti-tank units concentrated fire on immobilized targets. 2 bazooka teams and a 57mm anti-tank gun opened up on the stopped Panzer. The first bazooka rocket missed, but the second caught the turret ring, that vulnerable spot where the rotating turret met the main body. The explosion blew the turret partially off its mounting. The anti-tank gun's high-velocity shell finished the job, penetrating the compromised armor and turning the Panzer's interior into a death trap. 2 down. The 3rd Panzer had had enough. German armor was fearsome, but tank commanders weren't suicidal. Seeing 2 tanks destroyed in less than 3 minutes, the remaining Panzer reversed rapidly, laying down, suppressing fire but clearly retreating. The German infantry, suddenly without armor support, faltered. American machine guns opened up from prepared positions, and the German advance broke. Soldiers scattered back toward the tree line, abandoning the attack. The entire engagement had lasted less than 10 minutes, but it felt like a lifetime. Hayes slumped against the sandbag wall behind the crossed mortars, suddenly aware that his hands were shaking. Tucker and Morrison looked equally stunned, the reality of their survival slowly sinking in. The improvised weapon had held. 6 shots, and the tube showed stress fractures, but hadn't ruptured. They'd turned a defensive weapon into an offensive one, and it had worked. Lieutenant Richardson approached their position, his face showing the strain of command but also undeniable relief. "Sergeant Hayes, that was either the craziest or the smartest thing I've seen in this entire war." The German commander didn't specify which, but there was approval in his tone. Hayes managed a tired smile. "Little bit of both, sir." Richardson surveyed the crossed mortars, noting the stress marks on the tubes. "How many more shots before this thing fails?" Hayes examined the metal carefully, running his fingers along the fracture lines. "Honestly, sir, I wouldn't trust it for more than 3 or 4 more rounds, maybe less. We got lucky with the angle of recoil distribution." Richardson nodded thoughtfully. "Then we'd better make those shots count. Intelligence suggests the Germans will regroup and hit us again before nightfall. They can't afford to leave us in their rear area. Next time they'll come with more tanks, more infantry, and a better plan." The respite lasted until early afternoon. During those precious hours, Hayes and his crew made what repairs they could to the crossed mortars, reinforcing weak points and redistributing stress bands. Corporal Jensen stopped by with medical supplies and hot soup, checking each of them for injuries they might not have noticed in the adrenaline rush. "You boys did good work this morning," she said, her Chicago accent somehow making everything sound more grounded. "But you look exhausted. When's the last time any of you slept?" Hayes couldn't remember. Yesterday? The day before? Time had lost meaning in the frozen hell of the Ardennes. "We'll sleep when we're dead or when we're safe, whichever comes first." Jensen's expression turned serious. "That's what I'm afraid of. Look, I know you have to fight, but promise me you'll be smart about it. These men need you thinking clearly." She was right, of course. Hayes forced himself to eat the soup, to drink water, to take care of the body that housed the mind that would need to calculate firing solutions under pressure. Morrison and Tucker followed his example, understanding without words that staying sharp meant staying alive. The afternoon brought fresh snow and falling temperatures. Perfect weather for an attack, Hayes thought grimly. Low visibility would help the Germans close the distance before American defenders could effectively engage. At 1500 hours, the radio crackled to life. "All units, prepare for incoming. Aerial reconnaissance reports German armor massing at multiple points. Estimated 5 panzers, unknown number of infantry. Attack expected within 30 minutes. Hayes felt his stomach tighten. 5 tanks. They'd barely handled 3 that morning, and that was with the element of surprise. Now the Germans knew about the crossed mortars. They'd planned for it. Lieutenant Richardson's voice came over the command frequency, addressing all officers and NCOs. "Listen up. German forces outnumber and outgun us. But we have prepared positions, we have determination, and we have men who turn mortars into tank killers. Our objective hasn't changed. Hold until nightfall, then break out toward Allied lines. We just need a few more hours. Hayes checked the crossed mortars one final time. The tubes showed significant stress now, hairline fractures visible along the reinforcement bands. 3 more shots, maybe 4 if they were lucky. After that, the weapon would be done. Morrison noticed his examination. "How bad is it, Sarge?" Hayes considered sugarcoating the truth, then decided his crew deserved better. "Bad. We've pushed the metal past its limits. The next time we fire, there's a real possibility of catastrophic failure." Morrison swallowed hard, but nodded. "Then we better make each shot count." Tucker finished loading preparation, his movements methodical, despite obvious fatigue. "My granddaddy fought in the First World War. He used to say that sometimes history comes down to moments when ordinary men do impossible things. Reckon this is one of those moments." The German barrage began at 15:30, heavier than the morning assault. The ground erupted in continuous explosions, shells impacting so rapidly they created an almost unbroken roar. Hayes and his crew huddled in their reinforced position, protected by sandbags and prayer. Through brief gaps in the explosions, Hayes caught glimpses of German forces massing, 5 Panzers, as intelligence predicted. But these weren't the medium tanks from the morning. These were Tiger IIs, massive 70-ton monsters with frontal armor that could shrug off most Allied weapons. Behind them, Hayes estimated at least 100 infantry, probably more. The Germans weren't taking chances this time. They were bringing overwhelming force. The barrage lifted after 30 minutes, leaving ears ringing and nerves shredded. Hayes forced himself to focus, to think past the fear and exhaustion. The Tigers would advance in a coordinated line, infantry following in their protective shadow. American anti-tank weapons would bounce off that frontal armor like rain off a roof. The only vulnerable points were the tracks, the engine compartment in the rear, and the thinner side armor. Getting shots at those angles would require the Tigers to expose themselves, which their commanders wouldn't do willingly. "Unless we force them to," Hayes muttered. Tucker looked at him sharply. "What's that, Sarge?" Hayes pulled out his map, rapidly calculating angles and positions. The terrain here worked in their favor. The Germans would have to funnel through a natural defile, a gap between dense forest sections where falling trees from previous bombardment had created barriers. If they could force the lead Tiger to halt in that gap, the others would have to maneuver around it. That meant presenting their sides. That meant vulnerability. He keyed his radio to Lieutenant Richardson's frequency. "Sir, Hayes here. I have a plan, but it requires coordination with all anti-tank elements." Richardson responded immediately. "I'm listening, Sergeant." Hayes outlined his concept quickly. Use the crossed mortars to hit the lead Tiger's tracks as it entered the defile. Even if they couldn't penetrate its armor, they could potentially damage the tracks enough to immobilize it. Once stopped, it becomes an obstacle, forcing the following tanks to maneuver. That's when the bazooka teams and anti-tank guns hit the exposed side armor. Richardson was quiet for a moment, thinking through the variables. "It's risky. If we don't stop that lead tank quickly, they roll right through us." Hayes agreed. "Yes, sir, but if we try conventional tactics against Tigers, we lose." "This gives us a chance." Richardson made his decision. "Approved. I'll coordinate with the anti-tank teams. You focus on stopping that lead Tiger, and Sergeant, make those shots count." The German advance began at 1600 hours. The 5 Tigers moved forward in line abreast formation, engines rumbling like approaching thunder. Infantry moved in their shadow, using the massive tanks as mobile cover. Hayes watched through binoculars, waiting for the perfect moment. The lead Tiger, slightly ahead of the others, approached the defile. 200 meters, 150, 100. Now! Morrison, firing solution for lead tank. Target track assembly left side, elevation 27 degrees, deflection 08 mils. Morrison confirmed the data, his voice steady despite visible tension. Tucker loaded the right tube with their precious remaining high-explosive rounds, ready to fire. Hayes took a breath, centering himself in that strange calm that came with absolute commitment. Fire. The round launched with that now familiar crack streaking toward its target on the flat trajectory they'd created. Hayes watched it impact directly on the Tiger's left track, the explosion sending fragments of metal flying. The track held. These weren't medium tanks with vulnerable track systems. These were Tigers, over-engineered and brutally effective. But the explosion had caught the driver's attention, made him instinctively brake. The Tiger slowed, not stopped, but hesitant, right in the middle of the defile. Exactly where Hayes needed it. Left tube ready, Tucker reported. Same target, Morrison called out. Adjust deflection minus 02 mils. Fire. The second round hit the same track assembly, and this time Hayes saw the track links separate. The Tiger lurched, its left side grinding to a halt, while the right track continued moving. The massive tank slewed sideways in the narrow defile, its bulk blocking the passage. The following Tigers had to stop or risk collision. Perfect. Hayes keyed his radio. Lieutenant, lead tank is immobilized, blocking the defile. The second and third Tigers were maneuvering now, trying to get around the obstacle their lead tank had become. In doing so, they exposed their side armor. Richardson's voice came sharp and clear. All anti-tank units, engage exposed targets. Fire at will. The narrow forest defile erupted in fire. Bazooka rockets streaked toward the maneuvering Tigers. The 57mm anti-tank gun boomed, its high-velocity rounds seeking vulnerable side armor. The first bazooka rocket missed, impacting harmlessly on a Tiger's frontal plate. The second caught the track of the second Tiger, breaking it and stopping that tank dead. The anti-tank gun's first shot penetrated the third Tiger's side armor, not destroying it, but causing visible damage, smoke pouring from hatches. The German advance, so confident minutes before, was falling into chaos. 2 Tigers were immobilized, a third was damaged. The fourth and fifth tanks were trying to maneuver in impossibly tight space while under sustained fire. But the Germans weren't finished. The lead Tiger, though immobilized, was still a fortress with a gun. Its turret swung toward Hayes' position, the massive 88mm main gun, a dark circle of death. Hayes saw it coming, shouted a warning. "Take cover!" The Tiger fired. The world exploded in noise and pressure. The shell impacted 5 meters from the crossed mortars, the explosion picking Hayes up and throwing him against the sandbag wall. His ears stopped working, replaced by a high-pitched ringing. Vision swam. He tasted blood. Through the smoke and confusion, he saw Tucker pulling Morrison to safety, the younger man's leg bleeding from shrapnel. The crossed mortars stood at an angle now, their mounting partially destroyed by the near miss. Hayes forced himself to move, checking for injuries. Ribs bruised but not broken, ears ringing but functional, blood running from his nose but breathing clear. He crawled to where Tucker was applying a bandage to Morrison's leg. The private looked pale but conscious, gritting his teeth against pain. "I'm okay, Sarge, just a scratch." It was more than a scratch, but Morrison's determination was admirable. Hayes turned to Tucker. "Can you get him to the aid station?" Tucker shook his head. "Not while those Tigers are still fighting. We move now. We're exposed." He was right. They were pinned, and the crossed mortars were damaged, but the battle was still unfolding. The radio crackled. "All units, the 4th Tiger is withdrawing. Repeat, 4th Tiger withdrawing. 1 more Tiger remained active, the 5th, and it had learned from watching its companions die. Instead of exposing its sides, it was reversing, keeping its thick frontal armor toward the American positions while laying down suppressing fire. The German infantry, lacking armor support, was also pulling back. The attack was failing, but not decisively enough. If the Germans regrouped and tried again with better tactics, the outcome might be different. Hayes looked at the damaged crossed mortars. The mounting was partially collapsed, but the tubes themselves seemed intact. Battered but not broken, like everything else in this frozen hell. An idea formed, desperate and probably insane. He keyed his radio to Lieutenant Richardson. "Sir, I need 2 minutes and 3 volunteers." Richardson's voice came back skeptical. "For what, Sergeant? To make sure that last Tiger doesn't come back for round 3. Hayes explained his plan quickly. They'd realign the crossed mortars manually, bypass the damaged mounting entirely. It meant exposing themselves to fire, meant holding the tubes in place by hand while firing. The recoil would likely break bones. The stress on the already damaged tubes might cause catastrophic failure. But if they could hit the withdrawing Tiger's rear armor, the thinnest point, they might destroy it, might break German will to continue the assault. Richardson was silent for a long moment. "That's suicidal, Sergeant." Hayes smiled grimly, though no one could see it. "Respectfully, sir, this whole situation is suicidal. This just might take a few Germans with us." Another pause. Then Richardson's voice came back, heavy with the burden of command. "You have your 2 minutes. Make them count." Hayes looked at Tucker and Morrison. The corporal was already moving, understanding without words what Hayes intended. Morrison tried to stand, but his injured leg wouldn't support him. The private's face showed frustration. "I can't hold position with this leg, Sarge." Hayes gripped his shoulder. "You've done enough, Danny. More than enough. Get to the aid station. Tucker and I will finish this." Before Morrison could protest, Corporal Jensen appeared, seemingly from nowhere. "I heard you need volunteers to do something incredibly stupid," she said, her voice carrying dark humor. "I'm in." Hayes started to refuse, but Jensen cut him off. "I can hold a mortar tube steady just as well as anyone. And I'm not asking permission, Sergeant. I'm volunteering." Her determination reminded Hayes why everyone in the unit respected her. He nodded. "All right. Tucker, you handle the left tube. Jensen, you're on the right. I'll manage firing solutions and triggering mechanisms. We get 1 shot, maybe 2, before the metal gives out completely. Everyone clear?" They moved with desperate speed, realigning the damaged crossed mortars toward the withdrawing Tiger. The German tank was 600 meters away now, still reversing. Its commander probably thinking he'd escaped the kill zone. Hayes ran calculations in his head, factoring in the extreme angle, the damaged tubes, the impossible odds. The solution came together, more intuition than mathematics at this point. Tucker and Jensen positioned themselves, each gripping a mortar tube, bracing against the ground. Hayes loaded a high explosive round into the right tube, calculating one last time. Elevation 32 degrees. Deflection 14 mils. Rear armor target. "On my mark, you both brace hard as you can. This is going to hurt." Tucker nodded, his Tennessee drawl somehow still present. Always wanted to go out doing something memorable. Jensen's smile was tight but genuine. "My mother always said I had poor life choices. Guess she was right." Hayes found himself grinning despite everything. A Chicago nurse, a Tennessee farmer, and a Pittsburgh mill worker walk into a war. Sounds like the start of a bad joke. He loaded the firing mechanism, said a prayer to mechanics and fortune, and gave the command. "Brace, fire." The mortar round launched with a sound like the world breaking. The recoil was massive, far beyond what the damaged tubes were meant to absorb. Tucker grunted in pain, his arms straining to hold position. Jensen's face went white, but she held, her grip iron-strong. Hayes tracked the shell's flight, watching it arc toward the withdrawing Tiger. Time seemed suspended, that strange combat clarity making every second crystalline. The round struck the Tiger's rear engine compartment, penetrating the thinner armor and exploding inside. Fire erupted from the tank's hatches. Its engine seized, smoke pouring from every opening. The Tiger ground to a complete stop, disabled if not destroyed. The German commander and crew bailed out, scrambling away from their burning vehicle. 3 Tigers destroyed, 1 damaged, 1 fled. The German attack had failed. As the immediate danger passed, Hayes felt pain flood through his system. His arms felt like they'd been hit with hammers. His ribs screamed protest. His ears still rang from the near miss earlier. But they'd survived. More than survived. They'd won. Tucker carefully released his grip on the mortar tube, flexing fingers that had held steel through impossible stress. "I think my arms are broken." "Like I'm pretty sure they're broken." "But holy hell, Sarge, we did it." Jensen lowered herself to a sitting position, breathing hard. "I've done a lot of crazy things in this war, but that might top the list." Her hands were shaking, adrenaline finally catching up with her. Hayes examined the crossed mortars one final time. Both tubes had stress fractures running their entire length, metal fatigue beyond any possible repair. The weapon had fired its last round, given everything it had, like the men who'd built and operated it. Lieutenant Richardson approached their position as medics rushed to treat injuries. The officer's face showed exhaustion, relief, and something that might have been pride. "Sergeant Hayes, your improvised weapon just saved this entire unit. Those Tigers would have rolled right through us." Hayes accepted the praise with a tired nod. "The weapon did its job, sir. Now it's done. Can't push metal beyond its limits forever." Richardson surveyed the battlefield, the burning Tigers, the withdrawing German forces. "The intelligence officer says German command will likely pull back and consolidate after losses like this. We should have our window for breakout tonight." Hayes felt relief wash over him. They'd bought the time they needed. The impossible plan had worked. The next hours passed in a blur of activity. Medics treated injuries throughout the defensive perimeter. Tucker's arms were indeed fractured from the recoil. Compression breaks that would heal but needed immediate attention. Corporal Jensen worked efficiently, splinting his arms while explaining the injury in clinical terms. "You've got hairline fractures in both radius bones, probably some microfractures in the ulna as well. The recoil force exceeded what human bone can safely absorb. You're lucky they didn't shatter completely." Tucker managed a pained smile through gritted teeth. "Luck's relative, Doc. I'm alive, so I'll take whatever damage comes with that." Jensen's expression softened. "Yes, you are. And that's what matters." She moved on to Morrison next, cleaning and stitching the leg wound with practiced efficiency. The young private had been stoic throughout the battle, but now allowed himself to show pain as the adrenaline wore off. Hayes sat against a sandbag wall, his own injuries making themselves known now that immediate danger had passed. Every breath sent sharp pain through his cracked ribs. His head pounded from the concussion, vision occasionally swimming at the edges. Blood had crusted around his nose and mouth, but compared to the alternative, compared to being dead in a frozen Belgian forest, these injuries seemed almost trivial. Lieutenant Richardson approached with a medical orderly in tow. "Sergeant, you need treatment. That's not a request." Hayes started to protest, then realized resistance was pointless. The orderly, a young man named Patterson from somewhere in the Midwest, examined Hayes with professional competence. "You've got a concussion, probably grade 2, based on your symptoms. Those ribs need wrapping. And you're going to feel like hell for the next few weeks, but you'll live." As Patterson wrapped Hayes's ribs with practiced efficiency, the full scope of the day's casualties became clear. 7 men dead. 19 wounded, 5 seriously enough to require immediate evacuation. Against the alternative, against being overrun completely, those numbers represented a victory of sorts. But Hayes couldn't help thinking about the 7 who wouldn't see home again, about families receiving telegrams, about futures that ended in frozen mud. The price of survival was always paid by someone. Around the defensive perimeter, exhausted soldiers began the grim work of collecting the dead, preparing them for burial or transport. It was necessary work, treating fallen comrades with dignity, even in death. Hayes watched these rituals from a distance, feeling the weight of command settle more heavily on his shoulders. By mid-afternoon, with defensive positions reinforced and German forces apparently pulling back to regroup, Lieutenant Richardson called a meeting of all surviving NCOs. They gathered in what remained of a stone building that had once been someone's home, now just partial walls and shattered timber. Richardson stood before them, looking older than his years, the strain of command evident in every line of his face. "Gentlemen, today we achieved something significant. Against superior forces, we held our position and inflicted substantial casualties on the enemy. That success came at a cost, but it came nonetheless. Each of you contributed to that success through leadership, courage, and determination." He paused, his gaze moving to Hayes. "Special recognition goes to Sergeant Hayes and his mortar crew. Their innovation under pressure created a tactical advantage we desperately needed. I'm recommending them for formal commendation." Hayes felt uncomfortable with the praise, aware that dozens of men had fought just as bravely, had taken equal risks. "Sir, every man on this line deserves recognition. We all did our jobs." Richardson shook his head slightly. "Yes, you did. But some jobs required extraordinary initiative. Take the recognition, Sergeant. You've earned it." The meeting continued with discussion of their next moves. Intelligence suggested German forces were consolidating for another push, possibly within 24 to 48 hours. The American position remained vulnerable, supply lines tenuous, reinforcement uncertain. But the successful defense had bought precious time. Allied forces were advancing from multiple directions, slowly strangling German positions throughout the Ardennes region. If they could hold a little longer, relief would come. As darkness fell again, the temperature dropped even further, well below freezing. Men huddled around carefully concealed fires, trying to generate warmth without revealing their positions. Hayes found himself at one such fire alongside Tucker, Morrison, Jensen, and several other soldiers from various units. The shared experience of combat created bonds that transcended normal military structure. They were no longer simply sergeant and corporal and private. They were survivors, bound together by what they'd endured. The conversation ranged freely, from serious discussion of the battle to lighter memories of home, creating a balance between acknowledging their reality and maintaining sanity within it. Private Jenkins, the young Nebraskan Hayes had spoken with the night before, seemed different now. He'd survived his first major engagement, had fired his machine gun at advancing Germans, had seen men die and kept fighting anyway. That experience changed everyone it touched, aging them in ways that had nothing to do with time. "Sarge," Jenkins said quietly, his Nebraska accent soft in the firelight, "I was thinking about what you said last night, about Normandy Beach. How did you keep going after that? How do you process what you see and just keep moving forward?" Hayes considered the question carefully. It deserved honesty. You don't process it. Not really. Not in the moment. You compartmentalize, you focus on the immediate task, and you lean on the men around you. The processing comes later, in quiet moments, in dreams, and sometimes it never fully processes. You just learn to carry it. Jensen added her perspective, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd treated countless wounded. In medical training, they taught us about emotional distance, about not getting too attached to patients because some of them won't make it, but that's impossible in practice. Every wounded man is someone's son, someone's husband, someone's friend. You can't help but care. So instead of distance, I've learned to channel everything into action, focus on what I can control, what I can fix, and accept that some things are beyond my power. Morrison nodded slowly. My mathematics professor used to say that complex problems require breaking down into manageable components. Guess that applies to more than just equations. You can't solve everything at once, so you focus on the next step, then the next, until eventually you've worked through the whole problem. Tucker's Tennessee drawl carried philosophical weight. My granddaddy fought in the First War, France and all that. He came back different, quieter, used to sit on the porch for hours just staring at the fields. One time I asked him what he was thinking about. He said he was remembering the men he'd served with, keeping them alive in his mind, since they couldn't keep themselves alive. I didn't understand then. I was too young. But I'm starting to get it now. We carry the fallen with us. That's part of the burden, but it's also an honor. We remember them so they're not forgotten. The group fell silent for a moment, each person lost in their own thoughts about fallen comrades, about narrow escapes, about the randomness of survival. Hayes broke the silence eventually, steering conversation toward lighter topics. "Tucker, tell everyone about that time you accidentally drove your tractor through the church fence." Tucker groaned, but smiled. "I was 14 and thought I knew everything about operating machinery. Turns out there's a significant difference between knowing how to drive and knowing how to stop. The pastor's wife saw the whole thing and made me repair the fence board by board while she supervised. Took me 3 weeks. The story prompted others, shared memories of youthful mistakes and small-town adventures. For a brief time, they weren't soldiers in a frozen war zone. They were just people, connecting through shared humanity, finding light in darkness. These moments, Hayes thought, were as important as any military training. They maintained sanity, preserved identity, reminded everyone that life existed beyond combat. As the evening wore on, and men began settling into whatever sleep they could manage, Hayes made another circuit of the perimeter. The crossed mortars stood silent now, their tubes fractured beyond repair, but their purpose fulfilled. He ran his hand along the cold metal, feeling the stress fractures, the warped reinforcement bands, the evidence of forces pushed beyond design limits. This improvised weapon had saved lives today, had proven that desperation and creativity could overcome technological disadvantage. But it had also taught a lesson about limits, about the cost of pushing too hard. The tubes had given everything they had, and then a little more before failing. There was something almost noble in that, a machine serving its purpose to the absolute maximum before breaking down. Hayes hoped he and his men could do the same, give everything required without breaking permanently in the process. As darkness fell, the American unit began its breakout, moving quickly through gaps in the German lines created by the day's fighting. The temperature dropped below freezing, snow falling steadily, covering their tracks and providing concealment. Hayes walked alongside his crew, Morrison supported by Tucker despite the corporal's own injuries, Jensen treating wounded as they moved. They were a beaten-up, exhausted group, but they were alive. By midnight, they'd linked up with Allied forces advancing from the west, a full battalion of the 101st Airborne, fresh troops with supplies and support. The contrast between the fresh soldiers and Hayes's battered unit was stark. The paratroopers stared at the ragged men and women who'd held against impossible odds. A captain from the 101st approached Lieutenant Richardson, taking in the scene. "Your unit looks like it went through hell, Lieutenant." Richardson's smile was tired but genuine. "That's an accurate assessment, Captain, but we made it." The captain gestured toward Hayes and his crew. "I heard something about mortars used as anti-tank weapons. That true?" Hayes stepped forward, his movements careful due to his injuries. "Yes, sir. We crossed 2 M2 mortar tubes, modified the angle for direct fire. Took out multiple German tanks before the tubes gave out." The captain stared at him for a long moment, then shook his head in amazement. "I've been in this war for 2 years, and that might be the craziest thing I've heard. You're either brilliant or insane." Tucker spoke up, his Tennessee drawl carrying a note of humor despite his pain. "We've been debating that question all day, sir. Current consensus is both." The captain laughed. a sound that felt almost foreign after the day's violence. "Well, whatever it was, it worked. We've been tracking German movements all afternoon. After your unit broke their attack, German command pulled an entire panzer division back to regroup. Your action here might have affected the entire sector." Hayes felt the weight of that statement. They'd been focused on survival, on making it through one more hour, one more minute. The strategic implications hadn't registered, but wars were made of such moments, individual actions that rippled outward, changing the larger picture. Over the following days, as Hayes and his crew recovered in a field hospital behind Allied lines, the story of the crossed mortars spread. Engineers came to examine what remained of the weapon, taking photographs and measurements, trying to understand how improvised desperation had created something genuinely effective. A colonel from Ordnance spent an hour interviewing Hayes, asking detailed questions about the design, the mathematics, the practical challenges. Would this concept work in future combat? Hayes was honest in his assessment. 4 specific situations, maybe. The stress on the tubes was extreme. "We got lucky that the metal held as long as it did. Without proper reinforcement and higher-grade steel, attempting this would likely be fatal. It was a desperation move that happened to work." The colonel nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes that's how innovation happens. Necessity and desperation combining to create something new." He paused, then added, "There's talk of a commendation for you and your crew. What you did was beyond the call of duty." Hayes felt uncomfortable with the attention. "We did what needed doing, sir, same as thousands of other men in this war." But the colonel shook his head. "Not the same, Sergeant. Most men use their weapons as intended. You rebuilt yours. That's different." By January 1945, Hayes and his crew had recovered enough to return to active duty. The war was moving toward its conclusion, though no one knew exactly how long it would take. They were assigned to a new unit, helping train other mortar crews, sharing the lessons learned in that frozen Belgian forest. Tucker's arms healed, though he'd always have reduced strength in his left hand. Morrison walked with a slight limp, a permanent reminder of German shrapnel. Jensen's fingers recovered, allowing her to continue her medical work. Hayes carried the physical and mental scars common to all combat veterans, but he'd found a strange peace in knowing their desperate gamble had worked. One afternoon in late January, Hayes received a letter from Lieutenant Richardson, now a captain following a battlefield promotion. The young officer wrote about the unit's continued operations, about the men and women Hayes had fought alongside. He ended with a paragraph that stayed with Hayes for the rest of his life. "What you did with those mortars wasn't just about killing German tanks," Richardson wrote. "It was about refusing to accept defeat, about seeing a problem and creating a solution when none seemed to exist. That's what wins wars, not just better weapons or more troops, but individuals who refuse to give up. Thank you for showing us what's possible." Hayes folded the letter carefully, storing it with other items he'd collected during the war. He thought about that morning in the Ardennes, about the decision to cross 2 mortar tubes and gamble everything on untested theory. The memory was already taking on a distant quality, like something that happened to someone else. But the lessons remained sharp. Desperation could fuel innovation, standard tools could be reimagined, impossible situations could be survived through will, creativity, and the determination not to go down without fighting. Those lessons would outlast any weapon. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. Hayes returned home to Pittsburgh in June, carrying his memories and his scars. He went back to work at the steel mill, applying his understanding of metal and stress in more peaceful applications. Tucker returned to his Tennessee farm, where he'd tell the story of the crossed mortars to his children and grandchildren, embellishing slightly with each telling. Morrison used the GI Bill to attend college, eventually becoming a mathematics professor, occasionally shocking his students by mentioning he'd once calculated firing solutions under German tank fire. Jensen continued her medical career, becoming a respected surgeon in Chicago, known for staying calm under pressure, a skill developed in frozen Belgian forests. They stayed in touch over the years, letters at first, then phone calls, occasionally gathering for reunions where they'd remember the men and women who hadn't made it home. The crossed mortars themselves were lost to history, scrapped metal recycled for peacetime purposes. But the story lived on, passed down through military training, studied by engineers and tacticians, an example of field innovation under extreme pressure. Some historians debated whether the weapon was actually as effective as claimed, whether the accounts were exaggerated through retelling. But those who'd been there, who'd seen German tigers burning in a Belgian forest, knew the truth. Decades later, Hayes would occasionally give talks at military academies, asked to share his experiences with young officers and NCOs. He always emphasized the same points. Innovation came from necessity, not inspiration. Teamwork made impossible things achievable, and sometimes survival meant taking risks that seemed insane from the outside. But his most important message was about the human element. The crossed mortars worked because Tucker and Morrison and Jensen trusted him enough to try, because Lieutenant Richardson had the courage to authorize an untested weapon, because an entire unit refused to give up. The weapon was just metal and mathematics. The people were what mattered. In 1987, at a ceremony honoring World War II veterans, Hayes met a German veteran who'd fought in the Ardennes campaign. The former soldier, now a grey-haired grandfather, approached hesitantly. "I heard you speak earlier," he said, in careful English, "about the mortars you crossed. I think maybe I was there that day. My tiger was the one that withdrew." Hayes studied the man's face, seeing his own age and experience reflected back. "We were all just trying to survive," he said finally. "Doing our jobs the best we could." The German nodded slowly. "Yes, but you did yours with more creativity than most. I remember seeing those shells coming at us on that flat trajectory. We couldn't understand how mortars were firing direct. It was terrifying. They talked for an hour, two old soldiers sharing perspectives from opposite sides of a long-ago battle. By the end, they shook hands, acknowledging the strange bond combat creates, even between former enemies." Hayes died in 1995, at age 79, surrounded by family and friends. His obituary mentioned his war service, including his innovative weapons modification that had saved his unit. The crossed mortars were mentioned in military journals, in history books about the Battle of the Bulge, in engineering studies about field improvisation. But more than the weapon, Hayes left behind a legacy of creative problem-solving, of refusing to accept limitations, of turning defensive tools into offensive ones when circumstances demanded. That legacy influenced generations of soldiers, engineers, and leaders who learned that sometimes the best solutions came from reimagining what was possible. The physical crossed mortars were gone, melted down, and reformed into peacetime steel 70 years ago. But their impact remained, a reminder that in the darkest moments, human ingenuity could transform even the most desperate situation into an opportunity for victory. Hayes had taken two mortar tubes, meant for lobbing shells over obstacles, and turned them into tank-killing weapons. In doing so, he demonstrated something more valuable than any specific tactical innovation. He'd shown that courage, creativity, and determination could overcome seemingly impossible odds. That lesson endured long after the frozen forests of the Ardennes returned to peace, long after the last Tiger tank was silenced, long after the veterans of that desperate winter had passed into history. In the end, the story of the crossed mortars wasn't really about the weapon at all. It was about people, about Sergeant William Hayes and Corporal James Tucker and Private Danny Morrison and Corporal Sarah Jensen and Lieutenant Richardson and all the others who refused to give up when giving up would have been so much easier. It was about ordinary individuals doing extraordinary things because circumstances demanded it. It was about the human capacity to adapt, to innovate, to survive against impossible odds. That capacity, that refusal to accept defeat, that determination to find solutions where none seemed to exist, that was the real weapon. The crossed mortars were just how it manifested on one frozen morning in Belgium, when desperate men turned defensive weapons into tools of attack and changed the course of a battle. The metal tubes broke and were discarded, but the spirit that created them, that survived and endured, that was permanent. That was what mattered. That was what won wars and shaped history and gave meaning to sacrifice. That was what made the story of the crossed mortars more than just a tactical footnote. It made it a testament to human resilience, creativity, and the will to survive. And that testament would endure as long as people told stories of courage under fire.